The Oval Office is silent, bathed in the cold, flickering light of a midnight television feed. Outside, the streets of Washington, D.C. are eerily quiet, but in the digital ether, the world is catching fire. The low hum of a cello underscores the tension as a simulated emergency alert system tone pierces the air. Across every smartphone and news ticker on the planet, the headline is the same. The United States has formally withdrawn from the North Atlantic Treaty. In Brussels, the scene is hauntingly clinical. There are no protests yet, only a mechanical silence as the blue flag with the white compass, the symbol of the most successful military alliance in human history, is slowly lowered from its mast at NATO headquarters. For 75 years, this was the shield of the West. It was the unspoken guarantee that kept the peace from the Rhine to the Vistula. It was the ironclad promise that an attack on one was an attack on all. But tonight, the shield hasn't just cracked, it has vanished. Without the American nuclear umbrella, without the unmatched logistics of the Pentagon, and without the sheer psychological weight of the U.S. Navy, the security architecture of the modern world is evaporating in real time. In just 24 hours, the rules that have governed global stability since the end of World War II have been deleted. The Pax Americana is over, and as the sun rises over a fractured Europe, a geopolitical shockwave is about to hit every capital on Earth. The world is now standing on the edge of a dark, unpredictable precipice, and the fall has already begun. To understand why this withdrawal is a death sentence for the global order, we have to look at what was just destroyed. In 1949, the Washington Treaty created more than just a military alliance. It established what economists call the security premium. Article 5, the sacred vow that an attack on one is an attack on all, was the invisible foundation of the modern world. It made large-scale war in Europe unthinkable, and in doing so, it made global trade possible. For 75 years, investors didn't have to worry about tanks rolling through Berlin or the North Atlantic becoming a war zone. Stability was the default setting, a luxury paid for in American steel and blood. But in this timeline, that stability has been traded for a domestic promise. A hyper-isolationist America First movement, fueled by decades of internal division and economic frustration, has finally seized the levers of power. They didn't just want to renegotiate or burden share. They wanted out. The rhetoric was simple, punchy, and devastatingly popular. Why protect borders 3,000 miles away when our own are crumbling? In a matter of weeks, the populist tide becomes a policy mandate. With a single signature, the U.S. cuts all foreign military ties, turning its back on the Atlantic and retreating into a continental fortress. The silence in European capitals is deafening. In London, Paris, and Berlin, the realization hits like a physical blow. They are militarily blind. For decades, the European members of NATO outsourced their heavy lifting, their satellite intelligence, their strategic airlift, and their deep strike capabilities to the Americans. Now, the eyes in the sky are going dark as the U.S. redirects its reconnaissance assets. The nuclear umbrella that deterred the Kremlin for generations has been folded up and taken home. As European generals scramble to assess their dwindling stockpiles and fragmented command structures, they face a terrifying truth. They are woefully under-equipped for a solo defense, and they are completely out of time. The vacuum left by the American exit isn't just a political problem, it's a structural collapse. And as the realization sinks in, the first tremors are already beginning to shake the world's financial heart. The silence of the diplomats is quickly replaced by the roar of the trading floor. But it's not the sound of profit, it's the sound of a funeral. As news of the U.S. withdrawal solidifies, the Pax Americana that underpinned global finance for nearly a century dissolves in a single trading session. On Wall Street and at the London Stock Exchange, the tickers turn a violent, unrelenting red. This isn't just a market correction, it's a mass exodus. Investors, once confident in the stability of the Western world, now see only risk. Capital flees from any nation sharing a border with the East. In Warsaw, Tallinn, and Bucharest, local currencies go into free fall as billions of dollars are pulled out overnight, leaving behind hollowed-out economies and panicked populations. In the heart of the Eurozone, the financial crisis turns into a political civil war. The euro destabilizes as the two pillars of Europe, Germany and France, begin a bitter public feud over who will foot the bill for a new independent European army. Berlin, wary of its history and its purse strings, hesitates to commit the hundreds of billions required, while Paris demands immediate, massive military spending to replace the American shield. The unity of the European Union, already strained by years of internal friction, begins to crack under the weight of an existential bill they never planned to pay. But the most immediate blow to the world's pulse comes from the sea. For decades, the U.S. Navy was the ultimate guarantor of the North Atlantic shipping lanes, the invisible guardian of the global supply chain. Without that guarantee, the maritime insurance industry, the silent engine of international trade, goes into cardiac arrest. Lloyd's of London announces that insurance premiums for cargo ships crossing the Atlantic have skyrocketed by 1,000% in a single day. Suddenly, it is no longer profitable to move grain, oil, or microchips across the ocean. Global trade doesn't just slow down, it grinds to a halt. Before a single shot has been fired, and before a single tank has crossed a border, the world is already descending into an economic dark age. The cost of isolation isn't measured in policy papers. It's measured in empty shelves and a global market that no longer believes in tomorrow. And as the world's economy fractures, the geopolitical dominoes are already starting to fall. While the world's boardrooms are still reeling from the financial shock, the first geopolitical domino falls with a thunderous crash in Ankara. Seeing the American shield evaporate, Turkey, the alliance's second-largest military power, decides it will no longer be the frontier of a dying West. In a televised address that sends shockwaves through every capital in Europe, the Turkish government announces its formal withdrawal from what remains of the alliance. They call it a strategic pivot to the east, a move to secure their own survival. In a world where the old guarantees are now worthless, with this single move, the southern flank of Europe doesn't just crack, it vanishes. The Black Sea, once a vital theater of NATO presence, is transformed overnight into a closed lake, dominated by a new, uneasy axis of regional powers. But the most immediate danger isn't from the north. It's from within the former alliance itself. For 75 years, the Washington Treaty served as the only thing preventing two historic rivals from descending into open conflict. Without the mediation of NATO and the looming shadow of the U.S. Sixth Fleet, the long-simmering dispute between Greece and Turkey over Aegean gas fields turns white-hot. Naval flotillas from Athens and Ankara begin a high-stakes standoff in the disputed waters of the Mediterranean, their radars locked on one another. Without a common commander or a unified purpose, the West watches helplessly as two of its former members prepare for a naval war that would have been unthinkable 24 hours ago. This is the hidden reality of NATO's end. It wasn't just a shield against external threats. It was the glue that kept the peace between neighbors. And as the Mediterranean boils with the threat of a fratricidal war, a much larger predator begins to stir in the shadows of the East, watching the chaos with cold, calculated precision. As the Mediterranean fractures, a cold silence falls over the Kremlin. They have waited decades for this moment, not for a glorious charge of tanks across the North German plain, but for the slow, agonizing rot of the Western security architecture. In this timeline, the first move isn't a declaration of war, it's a whisper, it's a glitch, it's the gray zone, that lethal space between peace and conflict where an aggressor remains invisible until the trap is already sprung. Suddenly, the lights go out in Tallinn and Riga. A massive, unattributed cyber strike cripples the power grids of Estonia and Latvia. In the dead of winter, millions are plunged into a freezing darkness. Cell towers fail, digital banking freezes. At the exact same moment, GPS signals across the entire Baltic Sea begin to flicker and die. Commercial airliners are forced to ground as their navigation systems scream warnings, and massive cargo ships drift aimlessly, blinded by electronic warfare that has no return address. The message is clear: the digital walls have fallen, but the most chilling development occurs on the ground. In the Suwalki Gap, the narrow 60-mile strip of land connecting Poland to the Baltic states, the little green men reappear. Unidentified soldiers in unmarked fatigues, moving with professional precision and armed with high-end equipment, begin seizing key intersections and local communication hubs. They claim to be local volunteers protecting ethnic minorities, a script the world has heard before. But this time, there is no one to stop the broadcast. In our world, the presence of the U.S. 82nd Airborne and the Enhanced Forward Presence battle groups serves as a tripwire that no sane adversary would dare cross. But in this timeline, the American planes are gone. The paratroopers are back in North Carolina. Without the American nuclear umbrella or the massive logistical backbone of the Pentagon, the local Baltic governments are paralyzed by indecision. They look to Berlin and Paris for a decisive counterstrike, but they find only emergency meetings, calls for de-escalation, and diplomatic deep concern. The physical border of the West is no longer a line of steel. It has become a sieve. And as the sun sets over a darkened, silent Baltic, the first shots of a new, undeclared war are about to be fired in the mud of the Polish border. The silence in the Suwalki Gap is broken not by a thunderous barrage, but by the sharp, rhythmic crack of small arms fire. Near the village of Szypliski, a Polish border patrol encounters a roadblock of unmarked armored vehicles. There are no flags, no insignias, only the little green men who have become the harbingers of modern conquest. In this timeline, the skirmish is brief but bloody. For the first time in generations, soldiers of a European democracy are dying on their own soil in a direct clash with an unidentified invading force. In our reality, the Suwalki Gap is often called the most dangerous 60 miles on Earth. It is the narrow corridor that connects the Baltic states to the rest of the European continent. If it falls, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are effectively cut off, islands in a hostile sea. In this dark timeline, Warsaw screams for help. They look to their neighbors, invoking the remnants of a shattered alliance. But the response is a deafening, bureaucratic silence. In the streets of Berlin, Paris, and Rome, a different kind of fire is spreading. Massive anti-war protests erupt overnight. The slogan, "Why Die for Suwalki?" trends across social media, fueled by sophisticated foreign bot networks and genuine domestic fear. Populist leaders, sensing the wind, demand that their armies stay home to protect the hearth, rather than engage in an Eastern adventure. The political will to honor a collective defense treaty without the American enforcer behind it evaporates in a matter of hours. But even for the nations that want to help, the cold reality of physics sets in. For decades, the European defense model relied on a massive American logistical spine. Without U.S. heavy-lift aircraft, specialized fuel units, and satellite-guided transport hubs, the European Army is a paper tiger. German Leopard tanks sit idling at rail yards, waiting for civilian contractors who have already fled. French paratroopers have no way to reach the front with their heavy equipment. The realization is agonizing. Without the U.S. logistics chain, the European nations literally cannot move fast enough to make a difference. The gap isn't just a piece of land, it's a clock that is rapidly ticking down to zero, and the shield of the West is nowhere to be found. As the smoke rises over the Suwalki Gap, the political foundations of the European Union begin to splinter under the weight of a reality they were never prepared to face alone. In Paris, the Élysée Palace burns the midnight oil. The French government, long the champion of European strategic autonomy, finally sees its moment to lead. They announce the formation of a European Rapid Reaction Force, a desperate attempt to fill the void left by the Americans. But in the corridors of power in Warsaw, Tallinn, and Vilnius, the French offer feels less like a lifeline and more like an insult. To the nations of the East, France is a distant power with a history of seeking dialogue with Moscow, while Germany is a giant paralyzed by its own energy dependence and pacifist ghosts. The trust that once flowed through the veins of the NATO alliance has been replaced by the cold bile of historical grievance. Poland remembers 1939. The Baltics remember 1940. Without the American honest broker to keep the peace between allies, the old ghosts of the 20th century return to haunt the continent. The fracture turns into a full-scale rupture when Hungary and Slovakia, citing national survival and energy security, formally declare their neutrality. They refuse to allow the transit of any military equipment across their borders, effectively cutting the European continent in half. A vertical line of non-alignment now stretches from the Danube to the Carpathians. Severing the supply lines, between the Mediterranean and the North. This is the birth of the new Iron Curtain, but this time it wasn't built by Soviet engineers or Russian tanks. It was built by European fear, domestic populism, and a total collapse of collective identity. The West, as a coherent political and moral concept, is dying on the vine. It turns out that the glue holding these disparate cultures together wasn't just shared values. It was the overwhelming shadow of the American eagle. With that shadow gone, the European project isn't just failing to defend its borders, it is failing to justify its own existence. As the European Union descends into a series of protectionist fortresses, the sense of a unified Western world evaporates. And as Europe turns inward, devouring itself in a frenzy of blame and isolationism, the rest of the world watches. They see that the shield of the West hasn't just been lowered, it has shattered. And thousands of miles away, another titan realizes that the era of American deterrence hasn't just ended in the Atlantic. It has vanished from the Pacific as well. While the smoke rises from the streets of Brussels and Paris, the geopolitical focus shifts 8,000 miles to the east. In Beijing, the collapse of NATO is viewed not as a European tragedy, but as a historic opportunity. For decades, the first island chain was held together by the promise of American intervention. Now, that promise has been exposed as a hollow bluff. The conclusion in the halls of the Zhongnanhai is chillingly simple. If the United States will not defend its oldest allies in the Atlantic, it will certainly not risk a third world war for a distant island in the Pacific. The move is swift and clinical. Under the guise of an indefinite maritime safety exercise, the People's Liberation Army Navy establishes a total blockade of Taiwan. The silicon lifeline of the global economy is severed in an afternoon. No ships enter, no chips leave. The message to the world is clear. The era of the Pax Americana is over, and the era of regional hegemons has begun. In Tokyo and Seoul, the realization of this betrayal hits like a physical blow. For 70 years, Japan and South Korea traded their strategic independence for the safety of the American nuclear umbrella. Watching the U.S. abandon the Sawaki Gap to chaos, they realize their bilateral treaties are now worthless scrap paper. The nuclear allergy that has defined Japanese policy since 1945 evaporates overnight in high-security research facilities beneath the mountains of Honshu and the labs of South Korea. Secret programs are activated. They are no longer waiting for a phone call from Washington that will never come. The breakout period has begun. To survive in a world without the shield of the West, they must become the monsters they once feared. The global cascade is no longer a theory. It is a wildfire. The Pacific isn't just heating up. It is preparing for a nuclear arms race that will make the Cold War look like a rehearsal. And as the security architecture of the world melts away, the very foundations of the global economy begin to crack under the strain. But as the nuclear silos of the East wake up, the bank vaults of the West are being emptied. The U.S. dollar, once the bedrock of global stability, is suddenly revealed for what it truly was: a receipt for American protection. With that protection gone, the receipt is viewed as worthless. Central banks from Riyadh to New Delhi dumped their U.S. treasuries in a coordinated panic, sending the greenback into a terminal tailspin. The dollar hegemony doesn't just fade, it shatters. Nations scramble to peg their survival to the Chinese yuan or baskets of raw gold. Anything tangible in a world where the old rules have been burned. In Europe, the security premium manifests as a death spiral. Without the U.S. Navy patrolling the Atlantic and Mediterranean, the cost of insuring a single cargo ship skyrockets by 400%. Global trade doesn't just slow down, it stops. Energy prices in London and Berlin triple in a matter of days. Hyperinflation, the vengeful ghost of the 1920s, returns to haunt the continent. The euro, once a symbol of unity, becomes a weight dragging nations into the abyss. The global West ceases to be a unified market and transforms into a series of protectionist fortresses. Nations that once shared intelligence now hoard grain and fuel behind newly militarized borders. This isn't just a crisis for the elites. It is the sound of shattering glass in a Parisian supermarket. It is the food riot in the streets of Rome over a simple loaf of bread. The dark timeline has finally hit the average citizen's dinner table. As the lights flicker and the heating fails, the people of Europe look to their leaders for a solution. But the only solution left involves a choice that would have been unthinkable just months ago. A choice between starvation and a total surrender of sovereignty to the powers that still have the keys to the pipelines. The cold sets in first. Not just the physical chill of a European winter, but the psychological frost of realization. In the halls of power in Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius, the silence from Washington is deafening. They know the geography hasn't changed, even if the alliances have. One by one, the dominoes of Eastern Europe begin to tilt. They call them treaties of friendship and mutual cooperation, but the world knows them by an older name, Finlandization. To keep the tanks at bay and the heating on, these nations trade their sovereignty for survival, effectively becoming satellite states in a new Russian sphere of influence. The contagion of compromise spreads west. In Berlin, the industrial engines are seizing. Without the American security guarantee, Germany's leverage has evaporated. Faced with a choice between total economic collapse and a deal with the devil, the German government blinks. They sign a separate peace, a bilateral energy and security pact with Moscow that bypasses Brussels entirely. With that stroke of a pen, the European Union, the greatest experiment in post-war cooperation, exists in name only. It is no longer a union of values. It is a collection of fractured states, each cutting their own desperate deals to stay afloat in a world where might makes right has returned as the only law. Across the English Channel, London watches in horror. The United Kingdom, once the bridge between the old world and the new, finds itself a sinking island, abandoned by an isolationist America, and shunned by a continent that has turned its back on liberal democracy to survive. Britain stands alone. The special relationship is a ghost, and the European mainland is becoming a fortress of authoritarian pragmatism. The cradle of the Western Enlightenment is dimming, flickering out as the lights of the Kremlin burn brighter than they have in a century. The geopolitical collapse of Europe is complete. The West as a coherent moral and political entity is dead. But as the world settles into this new dark order, the architects of this withdrawal, the Americans who believed they could simply walk away from the world's problems, are about to discover that a fortress is just another name for a prison. They thought they were shedding a burden, but they were actually dismantling their own walls. Inside the borders of Fortress America, the silence is heavy. The promise made to the American people was simple. Bring the boys home, stop spending billions on ungrateful allies, and watch the domestic economy soar. But as the gates of the Republic slammed shut, the world outside didn't just stop fighting, it stopped buying. The Great Withdrawal has triggered a Great Depression. American industrial giants watch their global market shares evaporate overnight. In a world fragmented by regional hegemons and protectionist trade barriers, Made in America has become a luxury no one can afford, or a provocation no one is allowed to purchase. The dollar, once the bedrock of global stability, is being dumped by central banks from Riyadh to Beijing. As the greenback loses its status as the world's reserve currency, the cost of living skyrockets. The peace dividend that was supposed to rebuild American infrastructure is swallowed whole by hyperinflation. The military, now confined entirely to domestic bases, has become a crushing budgetary burden. Without the strategic depth of overseas bases, the U.S. Navy has been reduced to a glorified coastal guard. The Air Force is a fleet of expensive relics with nowhere to fly. The trillion-dollar defense budget, once an investment in global hegemony, is now a dead-end expense that the taxpayer can no longer sustain. To keep the silos manned and the borders patrolled, the government is forced to gut social programs, fueling a wildfire of civil unrest. From the Pacific Northwest to the Atlantic coast, the isolationist promise has turned into a nightmare of breadlines and bitter protests. The realization finally hits home, etched into the faces of a disillusioned public. The United States didn't shed a burden. It threw away its shield. By retreating behind its oceans, America hasn't made itself safer. It has made itself a target, isolated, impoverished, and profoundly alone. The superpower hasn't just left the stage, it has set the theater on fire. And now the smoke is beginning to choke the actors left inside. And as the internal lights of the nation begin to flicker, a new threat is emerging, one that doesn't need a single ship or tank to cross the Atlantic. But the true end of the American era doesn't arrive with a declaration of war or a nuclear flash. It begins with a sudden, deafening silence. Deep beneath the Atlantic, in the crushing dark of the ocean floor, the fiber optic veins that pulse with the world's data are severed. A massive, unattributed cyber strike targets the primary undersea cables connecting New York to London, and in an instant, the digital bridge between the old world and the new is burned. The internet as we know it, a global borderless commons, fractures. The splinternet becomes a terrifying reality. Within hours, American citizens find themselves cut off from the European web. London becomes a digital island. The flow of information, once the lifeblood of the West, is replaced by state-sponsored propaganda and localized intranets. In this digital dark age, the truth becomes a casualty of geography. As the data stops flowing, the last vestige of Western unity the Five Eyes intelligence sharing network disintegrates. Without the trust of the NATO framework, Washington, London, and Canberra stop talking. The shared surveillance that once prevented terror attacks and tracked rival movements is replaced by a toxic cloud of mutual distrust. Former allies now treat each other's signals as hostile intrusions, convinced that their old friends are now hacking their grids to survive the global collapse. The result is a total information blackout. In the vacuum of knowledge, fear breeds monsters. Without reliable intelligence or high-speed communication, rumors begin to spread like wildfire across the disconnected networks. Unverified reports of nuclear silos being activated in the Ural Mountains circulate alongside whispers of American subs moving into strike positions. In this timeline, the world is flying blind, and every nation has its finger hovering over the red button, unable to confirm if the threat is real or a ghost in the machine. The darkness isn't just coming, it's already here, and the West is now too blind to see its own end. In the gray, rain-slicked courtyard of the NATO headquarters in Brussels, the silence is heavier than any explosion. There are no cheering crowds, no grand speeches, and no television cameras to broadcast the moment to a fractured, disconnected world. A handful of weary officers, their uniforms stripped of the insignias that once symbolized a collective shield, stand at attention in the biting wind. The blue flag, bearing the four-pointed compass, rose that guided the free world for 75 years, is slowly lowered for the last time. As the fabric is folded into a tight, silent triangle, the most successful military alliance in human history officially ceases to exist. The West is no longer a map. It is a memory. In its place, the world regresses to a brutal 19th century logic, the era of the regional hegemon. Without a global stabilizer to enforce the rules of the road, the concept of international law dissolves into the older, colder reality of might makes right. The globe is carved into jagged spheres of influence, where the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Russia consolidates its near abroad with an iron fist, while China's shadow stretches across the entire Pacific, unchallenged and absolute. In Europe, the old ghosts of nationalism have fully awakened, and borders that were once invisible are now reinforced with concrete, steel, and deep-seated suspicion. Future historians in this dark timeline do not record a single catastrophic battle as the final blow. Instead, they write the obituary of a moral and political entity that simply lost the will to survive. The West is declared dead, not because its cities were burned, but because its spirit of collective security was discarded for the illusion of short-term safety. The era of democratic solidarity is replaced by a transactional, paranoid scramble for survival, where every nation is an island and every neighbor is a potential predator. The what if has reached its ultimate, chilling conclusion. A world where peace is no longer a shared goal, but merely a temporary lull between the inevitable collisions of empires. The shield has been shattered, the sword is drawn, and the light of the 21st century has been extinguished. But as the screen fades to black on this fractured world, we must pull back from the edge of the abyss. This dark reality remains a fiction for now. In our world, the shield of the West hasn't shattered. In many ways, it is hardening. Contrary to the isolationist nightmare we just explored, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is currently experiencing its most significant transformation since the end of the Cold War. Look at the map today. Far from a mass exodus, we are witnessing a historic expansion. The recent accession of Finland and Sweden hasn't just added two of the world's most sophisticated militaries to the alliance. It has fundamentally redrawn the security map of Northern Europe, effectively turning the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake and closing the very gaps we saw exploited in our alternate timeline. Under the NATO 2030 initiative, the alliance is pivoting from a reactive posture to a proactive one, pouring resources into cyber defense, space assets, and a new generation of high-readiness forces designed to deploy in hours, not weeks. The primary reason our dark timeline hasn't come to pass is a concept known as the tripwire effect. In the real world, the presence of U.S. and Allied troops in the Suwalki Gap or the Baltics serves a purpose far greater than their sheer numbers. They are a geopolitical line in the sand. To strike a single one of these units is to glass break the entire weight of the American nuclear and conventional arsenal. It is this invisible architecture of certainty, the absolute knowledge that an attack on one is truly an attack on all, that prevents the first domino from ever falling. While the alliance faces internal political friction and debates over burden sharing, the fundamental reality remains. The cost of leaving is still infinitely higher than the cost of staying. For now, the umbrella remains open, and the storm is kept at bay. The dark timeline we've explored today serves as a sobering reminder that the peace we enjoy is not an inherent state of nature. It is a construction, a complex, expensive, and often frustrating machine that runs in the background of our lives. This global security architecture is like oxygen. You don't think about it, you don't feel it, and you certainly don't appreciate it until it's gone. Only when the lungs of the international order begin to fail do we realize how much we relied on the invisible air of collective defense to breathe. While critics rightly point to the alliance's flaws, its internal bickering, and the heavy burden of its maintenance, we must weigh those costs against the true alternative. The alternative isn't a world of peaceful, independent states minding their own business. It is a descent into a chaotic, multipolar dark age where might makes right and the weak suffer what they must. It is a return to a 19th century jungle where a single border dispute can ignite a global conflagration, and where the concept of the West simply ceases to exist. In our reality, the shield still holds. The treaties remain sealed, the troops are stationed, and the structural integrity of the post-war world, however strained, remains the foundation upon which global trade and individual liberty rest. We live in the timeline where the dominoes are still standing. But as we've seen today, that stability is more fragile than it appears, held together by the thin parchment of a treaty and the shared will of nations to stand together. The world, as we know it, is built on a series of choices, some made decades ago in the shadow of a world war, and others being made right now in the halls of power. If you want to understand the forces keeping our world together and the scenarios that could tear it apart, subscribe. Join us as we continue to peel back the layers of history and geopolitics to see what lies beneath. Because, as we've learned, history is only ever one decision away from changing forever. Thank you for watching.